Thanks for coming tonight. We're going to spend a little time on this whole season, this Passion Week is what we call it. We've kind of entitled this, It's a Nice Little Story. But the reality is it's not a very nice little story. And so what we're going to try to do, both last Sunday and then this coming Sunday, but right now, we're going to try to peel back that nice little story. Like you do almost sometimes in Disneyland, if you've ever been there, they have this place in the Magic Kingdom, and they have a book a lot like this, and it kind of tells all the stories of Disney and Cinderella and all those kinds of things. It's a nice little story. But the reality is this story is not very nice, and so we've tried to reflect that. And so we're going to peel that back. And in fact, before I do that, though, I want to give you a warning. A little while in the service, we're going to give you an opportunity to just kind of spend some time and respond. So we're going to take about 10 minutes. It'll just be quiet in here where you can just pray, think, contemplate, wrestle with issues in your own head and your heart. During that time, we're also going to give you an opportunity, if you'd like to, if as a result of kind of the things you're wrestling with, you just feel like, you know what, I need to wash my hands. I just need to wash my hands. I just need, there'll be a station right here where you can come and just pour that out, kind of wash your hands. There's no soap, but the water will do it. If during that time you need to pray with somebody, you think, I just need to pray with somebody. There's 2 stations here that have people here that will just be able to pray with you if you need to come forward and do that. Or if there's an issue in your life where you feel like, and this is a pretty radical thing to do, right? If you need someone to wash your feet, because during that last night of Jesus' life, he washed the feet of his disciples. They were the ones, he's the one who humbled himself, right? To wash their feet. If there's something in your life, you just think, I need my feet washed. Now, I know your feet are stinky and they're sweaty and the whole 9 yards, I get it, but who cares, and that's the very point, right? And if you need to have your feet washed, there's 2 stations over here where you can come, and there will be 2 elders there and their wives to be able to help wash your feet with you, okay? So, and if none of those really fit what you need, we'll just give you the chance to sit where you're at and just be quiet on a night like tonight. Because tonight's one of those kind of nights where sometimes you just need to be quiet. The world's a really crazy place. It goes really fast, and it's chaotic, and it's full of confusion, and it's full of conflict, and sometimes we need to maybe just let it be quiet for a little while. So that's kind of where we're headed tonight. Now, what I'd like to do is we peel this back a little bit. My temptation is, or the temptation I think sometimes at Christmas time or at Easter time or Good Friday, is to kind of try to do a reenactment of the thing, of whatever happened 2,000 years ago. And you know how they do that kind of at Gettysburg? They do a reenactment of the Gettysburg. And problem is we don't have the kind of resources to reenact it all that big. And it ends up being kind of a cheap little drama, and it's just, and so we're not going to try to reenact it. But what I'd like to do is take you back to the time 2,000 years ago when Jesus went through this. And I'm just going to walk through in the book of Matthew some of the things that happened and bring us to a point of what I think it would have felt like this particular evening, on Friday evening of that time. What was going on? And if we were there, what would that have been like? Who would we have identified with? What would it have been like? So we want to start with this. In Matthew chapter 21, Jesus is coming into the city on Palm Sunday, and he's exposing the religious leaders for what they're really all about. And this is what we covered on Palm Sunday, but look at this. It says, and the crowds went before him and following him, and they were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. So they're like excited. He's coming into town. It's an amazing thing. They think he's going to take over. There's something maybe going to happen, not an insurrection, but maybe there'd be a peaceful takeover. And they're excited because here's this prophet. Here's this amazing man named Jesus. And it says that when he entered into Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, who is this? And the crowd said, hey, it's the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And they're all excited. I didn't write it down here, but the reality is the Pharisees come to Jesus and they say, hey, Jesus, can you tell those guys to shut up, please? Can you tell them to knock it off? And Jesus says, well, I could, but if I did, the very stones around us would praise him. And I'm sure that rocked their world a little bit, right? But then he goes and he cleanses the temple. And that's a great way to ruin a great start, And he goes and he cleanses the temple. It says here, and he said to them, it is written that this house shall be called a house of prayer, but you will make it a den of robbers. And then it says that he began to heal the lame and the blind. But then in verse 15 it says, but then the chief priests and all the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children singing out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David. And they were indignant. You get this sense, as the more Jesus was revealed for who he actually was, there were many people who were more and more and more against him and turned against him. They were indignant of all these things that describe here, wonderful things that he was doing. Wow, that's an amazing response, isn't it? Then after that, when Jesus left the temple, it says that he cursed the fig tree. You think, well, that's a weird thing to do. Why would he do that? Well, here's the reality is that it was proclaiming to be authentic on the outside, this fig tree. It had leaves. It looked just like a fig tree. The problem is it didn't have any fruit. A fig tree that has leaves has fruit. It says, yeah, look at us, we're really good. And he curses it because it really actually wasn't producing any fruit. It failed to live out the true fruit of the Spirit of God. And so he curses it. Wow, that's incredible. Then Jesus tells the parable of the two sons. The one son who claimed to obey, but really didn't. And the other son who says, I don't really want to obey, but eventually he did. And actually, these actions reveal their true hearts. And he's starting to reveal the hearts of these religious leaders. That on the outside, they look good, but on the inside, they are very corrupt. Then he tells the parable of the tenants. And that the fact that there was a land that was rented out. And it rented out to people who were ruining it, but weren't taking care of it. And they are abusing the privilege of being on that land. And so it says that he took it away, and the privilege would be given to those who would be faithful stewards of the land. And he begins to reveal their hearts of these religious leaders, that they were like controlling the land, but they really weren't being good stewards of what he'd given them. And then at the end of that interaction, he says this, and when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. And it just cut them to the quick. But it didn't change their hearts. In fact, it made it more hard. He says this in verse 46, and although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. They wanted to arrest him. They wanted to take him out, but they were afraid of the people because the people really thought he was a prophet. Well, after that, Jesus tells the parable of the wedding feast. It's this glorious event that he describes, and it's scorned by those he invites. He invites all these people to the wedding feast, and very few of them came. They said, I'm busy. Got other things to do. Thanks, but I won't be there. And so the one putting on the wedding feast said, go invite everybody else. Go into the corners of the world and invite everybody else. And then there were those who would come, and they never dreamed they'd be included. And they felt honored to be there. And that's the kingdom of heaven. Those who don't deserve a party are invited to the party because that's where he wants. Then he goes on and he tells this story about paying taxes to Caesar. They're trying to trap him and say, who should we pay taxes to? And he says, I'll tell you what, the trinkets you owe Caesar, give it to him. But the beautiful, wonderful, incredible royalty of God, why don't you give that to him? And I think that's what he's calling us to do, is to give our best to who God is. And he was saying that to these people there. And then he also talked to the Sadducees about the resurrection. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. They thought it was just annihilation. And Jesus here takes their twisted thinking. He begins to say, you know what? Life is eternal. And it matters. Some will have eternal life and others will have eternal death. But there's no annihilation to these Sadducees because life continues. Wow. And then they begin to ask him, a lawyer comes to him and says, hey, what's the greatest commandment in the scriptures? They're trying to trap him. And he says, here's what the deal is. You need to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your mind, and with all of your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. He began to clarify the message. But there were those who began to buy it more and more, and there were those who began to reject it more and more during this time. And then in chapter 23, he began to talk about godly leadership versus ungodly leadership, and he describes them to a T. And then, and at the end of that, he says this. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. And I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Remember, that's what had been said to him on Palm Sunday. And he says, what you've done to this place destroys it. And you've left it so badly. And he says, you won't see me again until you say this again. When he comes back, when he has Lord of Lords and King of Kings written on his thighs, and he's going to have eyes of fire and a tongue of a sword, and he'll come to take over. It's going to be incredible. Well, he goes on in here in chapters 24 and 25 to talk about his second coming, what it's going to look like, feel like, what's going to happen. And he began to warn them of that. But then in chapter 26, verse 1, look at this. There's a plot to kill Jesus. The plot thickens. It says, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days, so we're 5 days into the week now, and after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. And then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and to kill him. You see, their fear of the people began to be dissipated, and they began to be absolutely committed to killing him. That evening, Jesus went back to Bethany, and there was a woman there who took a flask of incredibly expensive perfume. And during dinner, she poured it on Jesus' head. And everyone in the room was absolutely shocked. And they said, why would you waste that? Why would you do that? That was amazingly expensive. And Jesus says, you guys, you don't get it, do you? There will always be poor, but this woman has understood who I am. And she poured this out. And it says that the whole world will remember this lady for her extravagant worship by pouring out this expensive oil. It says the whole world will remember. So I dare not leave it out tonight, because we need to remember her. Right after that, it talked about Judas betraying Jesus. It seems to me that it's the whole world will never forget this man's profound mistake over 30 slimy little pieces of silver. We use his name now as a joke in life, don't we? Judas. The Judas. Wow, it's amazing. In fact, when Judas really figured out what was really going to happen, he hanged himself. Wow. Well, then after that, it was the last time that Jesus would be with his men at what we call the Last Supper. And at the end of that, Jesus said, I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it, and drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. It's kind of an amazing thought, isn't it? That last night is the last time he did it until the day we see him at what's called the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven. That he hasn't partaked in this. We do it often to remember what's happened, but he said, I'm going to wait till you're all together again. Wow. And after that is Peter's denial is forecast. Remember, it's getting intense here, and Jesus tells Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter said, never. And then not too long after that, a little girl asked him, aren't you one of the disciples? He said, no. Another woman asked him. He said, no. Denies Jesus 3 times. I think Jesus sees his vulnerability of his closest friend. And maybe the vulnerability of our lives too, it seems to me. Well, after that, then, Jesus took his men and they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. And there he asked them to stand by while he prayed. And they fell asleep. And he came and he woke them up and he said, you guys, can't you? This is the hardest moment of my whole life. Can't you stay awake? And they said, yeah, sure. And he went back to pray again and they fell asleep again. And he sees their vulnerability. They weren't even able to stay awake with him. I don't know what that felt like for him, but it couldn't have felt good. And then there's the arrest and the mockery of these trials. His men have deserted him. They've all run for the hills. He's by himself. Jesus, I think, demonstrates his strength and his humility as he is afflicted and humiliated in ways that we can't even talk about. These trials where he went back and forth from Caiaphas to Herod to Pilate, back to Caiaphas, and they wanted to kill him. And Jesus, in his own humility, takes this beating that they've decided to give him. And then it comes to a point where they're ready to do something, and Pilate wants to let him go, and there's a tradition to let someone go. And so he asks them, who do you want? And the crowd begins to yell for Barabbas, who's simply a common criminal. And they stir the crowd up to say, hey, we want Barabbas, kill Jesus, crucify Jesus. And Jesus just stays quiet. And they let Barabbas go. And then eventually they took Jesus and they stripped him really literally to nakedness and they nailed him to a cross. And he was there for hours. Probably nailed him on the cross at 9 a.m. At noon, it got so dark, like the world had never seen before. And for 3 hours, it was totally dark. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus finally says this, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then the very last thing he says in Greek is tetelestai. It means it is finished. It's over. It's complete. It's done. And it says that he gave up his spirit. And so when he gives up his spirit, it seems to me that the world enters into a darkness that it has never known before. It literally got dark. And I'm sure people wondered, what in the world's going on here? Because the grief, I think, that nature felt at the death of Christ. Wow. It seems to me that there is a grief that's so powerful. It says that the earth shook. The whole earth shook at this. And as a result of that, it says that the Holy of Holies, that the huge curtain, a foot thick, from top to bottom, ripped in half. And it looks as if then that the Holy of Holies was vacated of the presence of God. And really what happens here is the hope of shalom is destroyed. So shalom is a Jewish word for peace. But it's not like peace like we use it. It means that the peace, the fullness of who God is, in all of his beauty, in all of his power, in all of his presence, may it be with you. Shalom. And it's this huge thing. It's really what we ache for in life, isn't it? We ache for the goodness of life, the beauty of life, the hope and the love of life. That's what we ache for deep down inside. And it's called, in God's word, shalom. It's this incredibly deep-set, heartfelt, experienced reality of the presence and the beauty of who God is. And at this moment, it was absolutely destroyed. And I think what we're left with then is this darkness and grief, this vacatedness, this emptiness, and this peace that's been totally destroyed. So let me just ask or say, it seems to me that this was anything but a nice little story. That's just like the farthest from the truth. And so at the end of this story, here's what we have. Is we have a woman who simply has an empty flask. That's all she's got. This guy that she poured it out on is dead and gone. I don't know what that felt like for her, but it had to feel horrible. Just so empty. Her life feels about as empty as that flask felt. We have Judas, has the emptiness of this blood money. He'd given up his friend for just a few bucks. He walked away from the man who'd loved him for some money. Wow. The Pharisees, seems to me, they're simply left with the emptiness of their own greed. especially Caiaphas, the chief priest. He was going to lose a lot if Jesus was successful. He had a very good life going. He had a thing going between 19 years being the high priest. And between he and the Romans, they had a good thing going. And he knew he risked losing it all. And he said, we have to kill him. And he's left with that emptiness of knowing, I sent him to his death. What about the disciples? Can you imagine really to be one of the disciples and the loneliness that they're left with because of their own fear? They'd run away. They didn't know what to do. They're probably hiding in the hills, went to a friend's house, got as far away as they could get. That's hard to imagine. Or maybe even Peter himself, especially, he's alone with his cowardice. He claimed he'd stay with Jesus, and he walked away, denied him 3 times. Had denied the very life that he wanted, that he knew was right. What about Barabbas? You ever think about Barabbas? He's got to be filled with the emptiness of freedom. How empty must it have felt? He's free, but this didn't go down very well. You got to wonder, golly, my life was saved, but he was crucified? I'd like to meet Barabbas someday, see what that felt like and see where he's at. How about the crowds, the whole crowds? I mean, they're isolated from any hope now, right? For the crowds had hundreds of thousands of them had really greeted Jesus into Jerusalem, and they were so excited about what might happen. And that's gone. I mean, they're going to celebrate Passover, but it had to be a very, very empty Passover. I bet they just kind of went through the motions, thinking, man, what just happened here? You know, I find it interesting that the one lone Roman soldier stands decimated by the death of the one that he decided at the end of that, he said, surely that was the Son of God. Having watched what Jesus went through, the beatings, the flogging, the crown of thorns, nails through his hands, and Jesus never once complained. The hours he spent on the cross, and this Roman soldier watched it all. And at the end of it, he couldn't imagine that he was dead, but he said, that was the Son of God, for sure. That must have been a pretty confusing night for him, as he went back to his barracks and tried to make sense of it all. Well, I think it brings us back to this place of darkness and grief and vacated, and the fact that peace is destroyed. And it really brings us to the brokenness in our own lives. So that story simply helps identify today, right, for each one of us. In the places where we've fallen so short, where we feel that if Jesus doesn't exist or he's dead and he's gone, where does that leave us? Where does that leave you? Really. And that's what I want us to do here for the next little while, is wrestle with where does that leave you if this is the end? If Jesus, when he said to Telestai, it's over, it's finished, it's complete, if he meant, bummer, this is it. Where do you go? What do you have left? And I don't know about you, but when I really get in touch with that, there is a grief inside of me. There is a loneliness and an emptiness that I try to fill with so many things, but it doesn't work. And in your own life, the stuff that we've done, said, acted like, attitudes of our heart, where does it leave you if Jesus is simply dead? Now, we know that Sunday's coming, right? We do, and that's good. But Sunday doesn't make any sense unless we do Friday. It only makes sense if we do today. And kind of understand our brokenness and our emptiness and our sadness and our need for a Savior. Because we need Sunday morning to come, right? But I can't get there until I go through Friday. And so what we'd like to do is just the next 10 minutes, just be quiet in here. If you'd like to come and wash your hands, having thought through, God, I need to put this before you. I need to just offer it to you. Or if you need someone to pray with, you can come up here, they'll pray with you. If you need your feet washed, I know that'd be awkward, but I'd encourage, if you need someone to say, I would like to represent the gracious love of Christ, come and let him wash your feet. It's between you and God, but sometimes it's good to have another human being humble themselves to help you get there. After those 10 minutes, we'll take communion together, like the disciples did with Jesus that last night. So, why don't you take this the next 10 minutes? Really, we're just going to be quiet in here. We'll bring the lights down a little bit, and you can just spend some time wrestling with what if Jesus simply died? Where does that leave you? Where do you take your brokenness?